Staying in the Cape, but onto a different story now, gangsterism and social disorder can be traced back to the days of apartheid. It expanded, of course, and has become professionalized during the democratic era, especially in areas with high inequality. Well, we're joined now by criminologist Guy Lamb. Guy, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. We're coming out of a weekend where there have been all of these different efforts and raids held, driven by really what is a coming together of various stakeholders in Cape Town to try and root out gangsterism. But we know that, it's going to be a long fight, and it's not going to be easy at all.
Absolutely not. I mean, actually, gangsterism in the Western Cape goes back to the days of the Cape Colony under British or even Dutch colonial rule. So actually, gangsterism has been with us for hundreds of years, for centuries. So this is well entrenched. It's not going anywhere quickly. And this attempt to try and deal with, that we have, for example, a national anti-gangsterism strategy in the Western Cape. We have an anti-gangsterism strategy as well. I mean, the situation is, it's very difficult to deal with the problem of gang violence in the short to medium term. You really need long-term solutions to deal with this problem.
When we look at how officials are sitting about, trying to deal with this problem now, it seems to be in the form of raids. And, these are good interventions, but they're also very short-lived. They're short intervention programs, and they don't really speak to the context and the environment that allows this culture to continue being as self-sustaining as it has been over the decades, really.
Yeah, I mean, the key problem here is first and foremost the violence. Of course, there's other forms of criminality that come with gangsterism, but the real problem that affects the Western Cape is that of the gang violence. And I mean, the interventions that are happening from a police point of view are largely to try and stabilize the gang situation. So it's about trying to confiscate and seize as many illegal firearms as possible, as many rounds of ammunition as possible, to arrest obviously wanted persons, and that way try and sort of calm situations down. But of course, these are temporary measures. They really just do bring about sort of temporary stability. The point is, one has to deal with what are the key issues that are driving that violence, and what are the key issues that are leading to increased recruitment of young men into those gangs, and those young men then going on to perpetrate the violence.
Guy, do you think that we've done enough work to understand the criminal networks that are really behind, gangsterism and that survive out of this criminality?
Well, I mean, there's a fairly, solid amount of information that's out there. Obviously, we don't know the nuances and the kind of granularity of these kind of networks that are out there, but we do know that Cape Town and the Western Cape is a significant hub of international organized criminal networks and criminal groups. And we know the kind of drugs feed into that. We know abalone is a component of that. We know money laundering is a component of that. There are other kind of illegal goods and services that go on as well. So it's quite a significant part of the Western Cape economy. So are we doing enough about it? It's, we've certainly, there's some strategies in place. For example, we've got, that's recently been approved by Cabinet, the Integrated Crime and Violence Prevention Program. And that, I think, has a number of really useful, practical, and relevant interventions that can happen, particularly the ones that are focusing on kind of vulnerable homes where you've got vulnerable children, especially young boys, who, as a result of different risk factors may go on to join gangs and perpetrate violence. So there's a lot of good work being done there, but of course we need to be investing a lot within the Department of Social Development to be working with those families. And we also need to be investing a lot more in youth employment, because in many situations you have, it's only a minority of young men, but they are the most vulnerable group for joining gangs. But in many situations there's different factors that drive them into violence. Not having a job kind of makes them more vulnerable to this, especially when they're surrounded by gangs and, have family, financial commitments, and friends are involved in gangsterism. You will have to try and interrupt that cycle.
Guy, we often see what looks like cycles in as far as the violence that is concerned. Not to say that there are instances where there isn't violence associated with gangsterism, but certainly we seem to go through cycles of the mass killings that we've witnessed recently in parts of the Western Cape. What drives these cycles?
Yeah, there certainly have been cycles. Sorry, you're breaking.
Sure, no, apologies. You can go for it, Guy. Yeah.
Not a problem. I mean, the cycles are driven by different things. So, for example, within the Western Cape, we've had a sort of ongoing and escalating violence as a result of kind of more than 2,000 firearms that were sold by a corrupt police person directly to gangs. And that sparked a gang war, which has resulted in reprisal attacks. Certain gangs trying to take over other gangs' territories, and you've seen revenge attacks as a result of that. So it's been a sort of vicious cycle of that sort of violence for almost 10 years, even more than 10 years. And we've seen, for example, Cape Town's murder rate escalating, almost doubling in a 10-year period. But in the more recent kind of attacks we're seeing, where you see new gangs being formed, or certain gangs wanting to take up other gangs' territory and moving into that territory and trying, for example, to extort money out of businesses and using violence as a way to demonstrate that they're serious. And if you don't pay up to certain gangs for protection, that you will be, there will be violence perpetrated against you as a result of that. Some of them are around, revenge attacks that happen. Some of this mass violence that we're seeing seems to not necessarily be linked to gangsterism. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is, but some of it is about intergroup rivalries and clashes and conflicts between certain kind of extended family groups, and revenge is taken out for a certain violent act or humiliation as a result of that. So some of it is gangsterism, some of it is not. But I mean, it's largely around, often when the gang violence happens, it's about competition over territory. And when gangs also have access to a lot of firearms and a lot of ammunition, then we tend to see violence escalate.
When you talk about, the efforts that are currently being made and how that will...
I seem to have lost you, so I'm not sure if you're still on the line.
All right. And apologies for that, Guy. Unfortunately, then, we're going to have to leave it there, especially if you can't hear me on your end.